Hi, all. Thank you very much for joining us today again. This time we will continue our discussions on Rand's thoughts on the culture, and today's essay is Representation Without Authorization. To talk about it, we have James Valliant. He's the author of Creating Christ and the Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics. Before we begin, feel free to make any questions on the super chat feature on YouTube. If you're watching it live, we will be tracking it on time so that you can ask questions to James on this or any other topic that you would like to. Okay, let's start. And James, could you give a bit of a context for this essay? What is Rand talking about, and what was happening in the political sphere that she's referring about?
Well, Rand was writing in the early 1970s, and at that time, American history, as you know, is characterized, unfortunately, by racial discrimination. And until the 1950s, really until about 70 years ago, it was perfectly constitutional for southern states, for example, to discriminate in their laws, racially speaking. Only in the 1950s did the Supreme Court hold that racial discrimination by states, the infamous Jim Crow laws, which did segregate and discriminate on the basis of race, discriminating against African Americans for many decades, that was finally held to be unconstitutional in the 1950s. And that opened the door to a successful civil rights movement, which led to the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which attempted to correct previous racial discrimination in law. The 1964 Civil Rights Act made discrimination on the basis of race unlawful, and the Voting Rights Act turned around the way districts were apportioned. Voting districts in the Congress to the United States. States are broken down into voting districts to elect their representatives. And previous to all of this civil rights action, the voting districts were mindful of race in a discriminatory way against blacks. Following 1965 Voting Rights Act, it became unlawful, and the Supreme Court at about the same time held it to be unconstitutional that the voting power of certain minority groups be diluted. That was unconstitutional. That, in other words, the proportion of the population that was African American had to be consistent with the portion of representatives that that state was electing. So there had to be protected black districts, if you will. And if that didn't happen, that was considered racial discrimination because it was preventing African Americans from having representation, adequate representation, or proportionate representation in Congress. By the 1970s, this whole idea of racial quotas and racial preferences was to correct previous racial imbalances was becoming a huge issue. And in the 1970s, the Nixon administration began to impose certain racial quotas in terms of government contracts, so that when the federal government hired private contractors to do work for them, a certain percentage had to be set aside for minorities. This began a whole debate, a political debate in the 1970s on racial quotas. By 1979, several years after Ayn Rand has written this essay, the Supreme Court held that specific racial quotas at the University of California and other places in the famous Bakke decision were unconstitutional. On the other hand, these contracting quotas from the federal government were perfectly okay. In another case, they held that. And so there was a controversy at this very time when Ayn Rand's writing over racial preferences and racial quotas, and to what extent the law should recognize race. And it was very controversial at the time. Most Americans did not like anti-black discrimination in the law. Very much opposed it and very much supported efforts to make the law more less, let's put it this way, racially discriminatory. On the other hand, the American people very much rejected racial quotas. They still do. Even in liberal California, for example, last year in 2020, the California voters rejected any kind of change to their law. And back in the 1990s, California voters passed a law that said no racial recognition, in effect, by the law of California is acceptable, sort of ending racial preferences in optional areas. It didn't really end all racial preferences, but there was a law that said we don't like racial preferences. They tried to overturn that law in California last year by voter proposition, and it failed. It failed by an even bigger margin than the original proposition in the 1990s won. So the American people have, even in the most democratic blue state of California, have rejected overt racial quotas. Now, that was a big lecture about American history, but that sort of is the context of American history that sort of explains what Ayn Rand is getting at here. To what extent can the federal government or the state government recognize race in an effort either to discriminate against that race or to correct past discrimination against that race? And it's widespread. It's common. The practice is ubiquitous in the United States. For example, in terms of admissions to universities, our very best universities, systematically, and I think there's a really good case, Asian Americans have brought a case, for example, against Harvard, saying that they have been disproportionately disadvantaged by the hiring or by the admission practices of Harvard University, which favor African American students over Asians. Now, Asians tend to perform very, very well on test scores, grades. So when it comes to the meritocracy part of admissions, who is getting it based on merit and achievement, Asian Americans are very disproportionately disadvantaged when it comes to their actual numbers in admissions. There are also the same rules about quotas in government contracting that still exist today. And of course, in private business, it's all over the place. In fact, President Biden, when he first came into office just a few months ago, said that there would be very, very strict affirmative action. He specifically distinguished equality of outcome from equity. Equity appears to be, in effect, an argument for quotas, specific numerical quotas of minorities. And if you don't have those specific numerical quotas, then you are presumably a racist, a white supremacist, and you're no better than the Jim Crow segregationists of the past. Now, with all that as sort of setting the historical context, Ayn Rand is writing about racial preferences in the 1970s, which are already becoming a major issue, both at the federal government level, the state government level, but also in private employment practices.
I think one of the things that surprised me the most of this small short essay is that she usually starts with one issue and develops the issue, and then she goes through her answer to that issue. But in this essay, she first goes through her answer to the way that she thinks it's a positive, and then she goes through the negative. And I think the first question that I should ask you is, what is her view of voting rights? What are they derived from, and what is the value of voting? What does it tell you about rational judgment and the proper view of a government?
Well, the theory of the United States that got it started, its original theory of sovereignty was that the people are sovereign and that the government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, based on sort of a Lockean theory, John Locke's political theory. The framers of the American Constitution believed that voting was an important aspect, representation was an important aspect of government. They had a firm respect for individual rights, which superseded any power of government, of course. But when it came to the valid powers of government, the powers of government that they did grant to the government, those powers should be exercised only by elected representatives. That's the only way you can really get the consent of the governed and make sure it's the consent of the governed that's going on. Now, what's the practical effect of that? Does that mean that every time there's an election that's the quote morally legitimate or morally correct outcome? No. No, voting is no guarantee of a morally correct outcome, but voting allows for a peaceful transition of power, peaceful reform, rather than having to take to revolution and violence to effect change. Representative democracy, I use that word in the broadest sense possible. Representative democracy, so long as there's free speech and a recognition of individual rights, to some extent at least, there is a peaceful means by which people can effect change through persuasion, and rather than going to the streets with violence and revolution. And the idea of the consent of the governed manifests in many, many ways. The jury trial, for example. In fact, one would have to say that free speech and freedom of assembly are essential features of that as well. So for Ayn Rand, it is important that there be sort of a representative republic, because that is the only way in which we could really have a process of peaceful change. It's the only way in which we could really say that what the government is doing is enacting the consent of the governed. Now, this is an individual thing. Ayn Rand stresses here that insofar as there is a right to vote, it is a conditional one. Children can't vote, for example. The truly mentally incompetent and insane can't vote, for example. And the question, what that implies is that people have judgment, free will, the power of reason. And if they didn't have free will and the power of reason, it really would make no sense to give people any power to vote. Voting itself suggests that people are independent judges and that the individual is the one who does the judging. And so there's a principle in American law: one man, one vote. Now, what does that mean? The left, in arguing, for example, and the right agrees with them almost entirely on this point, in terms of voting districts, for example, congressional districts, yeah, we have to preserve the power of a certain racial minority. A certain specific racial characteristic is essential for the representative. That suggests something that flies in the face of the entire theory of the consent of the governed and the entire theory of representative republics and democracies, individual choice and judgment. It suggests, for example, in the case of race, that physiology is what determines a person's interests, a person's beliefs, a person's values, as if the physiology is the single most important thing about the person, that their political interests are really identifiable from their race. And of course, that's deeply offensive. That's wrong. As Ayn Rand points out, for example, a black college professor may have more in common with with a bunch of white scholars than he does, say, with union workers in another city altogether. But the same may be true of any other group. The fact that even 90% of, say, a racial group agrees with a position does not mean that you can base representation on race, right? There's that 10% who are not having their right to vote really being respected. They can't, for example, join up with a certain percentage of Asians, Hispanics, whites, women, gays, whatever, to ideologically change the outcome of the election, which is really what matters. What matters, of course, are the ideas. One can agree, for example, that that racism is wrong, and still believe that that racial outcomes aren't necessarily the result of systemic racism. The assumption being that the difference in racial outcomes must necessarily be, in any respect, must necessarily be the result of racism. And that's simply not so.
Yeah, one of the things that surprises me the most about this kind of framings is that people usually recognize that there is a problem and and then they sell you the idea that the only solution to the problem is the solution that they are selling. Um, so I was hoping to pitch this question later, but now that you have mentioned it, it was more like a devil's advocate question, in the sense of, I get that there could be a problem through these representational quotas, but at the same time, I think that there are some groups that have been left out in political issues. Let it be blacks, let it be women, let it be poor people. Um, isn't at least this thing trying to address this issue? And if this thing isn't the only solution, what is the real solution to that?
Well, it is not a solution to poverty. Let's take poverty, which is at least a non-physiological characteristic. It's the solution to poverty is not to be found in giving poor people more specific representation. It does not necessarily answer the question of what's best for the poor. The poor may have different opinions on the subject. There may be different approaches. If someone believes, for example, that socialism, or at least an aggressive welfare state, is necessary to combat poverty, they may be simply factually wrong. It may be bad for the poor, make matters worse for the poor. The fact that we give poor specific representation doesn't tell us that the poor actually know, agree, or that the majority of the poor will actually have the correct policy. There's no connection, there's no causal connection, whatever, between grouping the people together and having that group's interests actually protected. That's the problem. Saying that we're going to protect black representation, for example, does not necessarily result in the protection of black interests. And not only that, it doesn't even represent all blacks. And that's really the problem. The injustice is the assumption that all blacks have the same interest, the same approach to politics, the same outcome would be wanted, desired by all blacks, all members of the same group. And that's just simply not true. It ignores individual judgment. It ignores individual thought. It ignores free will altogether. And it says that your membership in some group, whether it's sexual preference or gender or race or social class or poverty, as if those things are determinative of your interest automatically. Well, that's a giant false assumption. There is no such way in which we can simply say, by giving these people the representation, we know their interests will in fact be better protected. That is a non sequitur that simply doesn't follow. And in fact, the recent history of my country demonstrates quite the opposite. The interests of African Americans have not been advanced in recent decades by means of racial awareness. In fact, racial awareness itself may be something holding back African Americans. It may be culturally or psychologically affecting a certain number of African Americans to be so racially conscious. Race consciousness itself may be part of the problem, and such racial quotas and racial awareness in districts and representation may in fact only aggravate the problem.
And my understanding is that India implemented sort of quotas in the voting in the country, and a big chunk of the justification was that if they push for this kind of legislation, the misogyny would decrease. But to my understanding, it's still the same. There hasn't been anything.
Quite the opposite. India has done, the history of racial quotas is usually mostly a very, very ugly one. The quotas, for example, for a long time, European universities would only admit, if they admitted any Jews at all, a certain percentage of Jews. Ayn Rand's own father became a chemist precisely because the quotas at university only permitted him to get into the chemistry department. He became a pharmacist, in effect, because he could get a chemistry degree, because that's what the racial quota for Jews letting Jews into universities permitted him at the time. And racial quotas in my country before the 1950s, for example, were generally very racist, ugly affairs, keeping blacks out. Much of the early labor movement in my country were white labor unions trying to restrict blacks from entering certain fields. So the entire idea is really a inherently racist idea. You really can't solve previous racism by more racism. You just sort of cast the idea in concrete, and you can never get past it. And again, the recent history of my country shows that. Rather than correcting the problem and therefore going away over time, which was the thought about racial preferences, they appear to be becoming further and further cast in stone and concrete, and more permanent, which of course doesn't make any sense whatever. You'd think that these racial preferences should fix the problem in the long run, and it's doing no such thing. It's only increasing resentment, radicalism on both sides, and racism from every extreme racial group out there.
And I would like to scratch a bit more something that you mentioned, the idea of regarding these things as physiological and having no regard for thinking, for the thoughts and ideas. And one of the things that Rand mentions at the beginning is that both dictatorships and determinism are a vicious circle that feed upon themselves. I mean, they're retractive in themselves. Could you explain a bit more why is that, and why? Because the people that want to enslave men have to destroy their reliance on the validity of judgments.
Well, that's it. If you freedom, the idea, you can understand Ayn Rand's justification for freedom when you understand that human beings have certain specific needs as the biological thing that they are. For the functioning of our method of survival, our basic means of survival, for that to actually function and operate, we need freedom. Freedom is the primary social condition, she argues, for the functioning of the human mind, for our basic means of survival, for our only means of really knowing. For that to work, well, we need freedom. That kind of a justification for freedom is more explicit than anything that has ever really existed. But really, the same idea is implicit in perhaps a thinner and less rigorous way than Ayn Rand gives us, in the idea of freedom, in the idea of representational democracy itself. It is a contradiction of the very idea of, as we said earlier, the very idea of representational democracy to say that people really can't think for themselves. Why would you ever give them a vote in the first place if they can't really think for themselves? Democracy makes no sense. Representational government of any kind makes no sense if people can't think for themselves. And yet, to achieve a world that they want, the left is willing to ignore that fact across the board, whether it's in economics, incentives, criminal law, foreign policy. All of them, you can see really the left is eager to ignore free will as if it doesn't exist whatever. And so if free will doesn't exist, then how must we treat people? Well, we treat them by the deterministic features and qualities that they presumably possess. And those are what? If you're a Marxist, it's a question of your social class, right? Whether you're bourgeoisie or proletariat will determine your interests, and we can sort of, from the Marxist perspective, simply define a person's interests. Now consider Marx, there's a classic determinist. You are really the product of your social class. Your thinking is the product of your social class. All of your interests can be defined and determined by your social class, whether you know it or not. Your labor leader maybe better knows your interests than you do, being a victim, say, of some capitalist propaganda in your head. There, you're really ignoring free will altogether, treating people as groups. Now, uh, compared to Marxist class analysis, race analysis is really crude, but it is basically taken over. And so the American left, for example, has become what they call intersectional. So it's not just Marxist class, it's a question of whatever group that might, the victim group or disadvantaged group that you might belong to, LGBTQ, Black, Asian, a woman, you name it, the various physiological, gender, race, other things that aren't chosen, sexual orientation, all of these unchosen features become important and will define your interests. So we can ignore your judgment. It's not a question of you giving authorization to your representative as an individual based on your ideas, based on your judgment. We know what your interests are. We know what your values are because we know that you're Black, you're a lesbian, you're a woman, and that intersectionality can sort of, we can define your interests just based on knowing that. That's the assumption.
And one of the thoughts that I've had over the last weeks is seeing all these, after seeing all this regulatory thing in the UK. For instance, one of the things that drove me crazy when I moved here is that bathrooms don't have electric plugs because God forbid that you by mistake take a toaster and I don't know, have a bath with that one. Um, but you know, you cannot be free for that, but you can choose if Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn are going to be your
Right,
leaders. But
right.
this is consistent with this kind of representation would be more consistent than choosing Boris Johnson. Then,
Well, see, just to the extent that it becomes an automatic thing. For example, in my country, they want everybody to vote. Everybody to vote. People in this country have, you know, in my country, there is a sad history of voter turnout in recent decades. Uh, uh, until, say, this last election, where everyone was sort of sent a ballot, voter turnout could be, 40, 50% of the population might not turn out for an election. The qualified voters, half the qualified voters almost, aren't turning out. Well, see, that really bothers the left. We want every single person to vote, whether they care, whether they know better. There could be some people selecting themselves out of the voting population because, look, I don't really care, or I don't know. No, that doesn't matter. Judgment is not, it's not a question of judgment or individual values or ideas. It's a question of getting everybody to physically vote so that we can count the numbers of the groups that are voting. And that's really basically what it comes down to in the mentality, for example, that you find in the West so often these days, as if people, you'll trust them to vote, but we can't trust them with electric plugs. No, 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 no. We can't trust them to take care of their own healthcare needs. We can't trust them to take care of their own retirement needs. We can't trust them to take care of really themselves at all. It's a wonder that people actually manage to survive. Yeah, it is a very low opinion of humanity that says that they must be herded by force, in effect, by government. And it is a bizarre contradiction to say, well, we let the herd vote. We count the mews coming out from the sheep, but that's about it. Because we define the sheep, in effect, beforehand as we come in by their group interests and values. and if representation itself is based on that, then it becomes harder and harder for ideas to matter. You treat people like barnyard animals, or you treat them, say, like in a Tolkien novel. You've got elves over here, you've got dwarves over here, you've got ents over here, and orcs over there, and you can know their characteristics based on the group that they belong to. Dwarves have certain characteristics and elves have certain characteristics, and that's really all that matters. We need certain dwarf representation and elf representation. Now, of course, even in Tolkien's universe, all these beings seem to be rational beings, and so Rand's theory might override and apply. But in his sort of view of things, there's just an inherent difference between these different types of people, and that's the meaningful difference. And if we group people in that way, dwarves over here and elves over here, it's going to be harder and harder and harder to get dwarves and elves to see themselves as anything else, as individuals, with individual interests that might have nothing to do with their group membership. Ayn Rand points out that the grave injustice here is precisely treating people as if they are simply members of a group and not individuals with judgment. If they did, they would see that having Black representation in my district simply because I'm Black may or may not help me, and certainly may or may not reflect my values or political ideas at all. That is tremendously unjust.
Thank you. And I think another thing in the essay is that she talks about how the the issue is usually not talked about openly, and she says that since Kant, there has been a wave of intellectuals trying to disguise issues behind the exact opposite concept, and she mentions um, that Kant hides mysticism behind the word of reason,
Reason.
and she also talks about more in when she criticizes Kennedy. But I found interesting that she also talks about that here. Could you comment a bit more on that?
Oh, well, what is there to say? Um, uh, could you rephrase the question? Could you repeat the question? A minute to think about this.
Basically, what I was trying to get at is um, why do intellectuals don't face things openly,
Oh,
and
yes.
what they're trying to achieve, and why they don't face that openly? Why didn't they don't say, like, your concept is wrong, let's go for another thing?
Well, if they were to say openly, as I say, most Americans reject racism in any form, corrective racism any more than the original discriminatory, keep them down, suppress them racism. There's no valid justification for racism, and the American people basically have that idea. So you would have to conceal, if you're an intellectual who wants racial quotas and preferences, for example, you'd have to conceal your motive as an effort to be non-racist. Your racism is non-racist. And this is really classic. If you oppose the racism of racial preferences, you're the racist. You're the white supremacist because you oppose racism. And this is a classic. It's just like Kant defending reason, but of course destroying the entire meaning and that validity of any actual reason. It's mysticism that he's arguing for and calling it reason. If you didn't have a rationalization, and most systems of philosophy are simply rationalizations for an outcome that the philosopher wants, right? And this is true across the board. This is true in politics. This is true especially in political policy issues. If they were to be open about their actual goals, that could create a political problem in itself. But more than that, they really want to achieve the opposite of the goal that they're after, and or at least to destroy the meaning, the actual meaning of the term, so that it loses any real strength. For example, individual judgment when it comes to voting. If we can classify people by their race, if they can be grouped by their and assigned interests by their race, you see, individual judgment, we're in effect treating them like we really believe they are, determined, automatons. So they really don't believe in free will, but they have to, for example, assume free will to get their policies across many, many times. Because people do believe in free will and oppose, for example, racism as a consequence.
And another issue here is is ethnic or racial diversity um, uh, a threat to totalitarianism. Basically, I tried to frame. It's one of the things that she talks about in the essay.
Yeah. Actually, totalitarianism loves, as she points out, for example, take this old Soviet empire. Oh, they would recognize the various ethnic divisions in the Soviet empire, and they would make a big deal about the local folk customs, the language, the food, the dancing styles, the local dressing styles, and make a big deal about that. As she points out, it's a way of flattering uh, their oppressed slaves, the different groups of their oppressed slaves. And there are people who will take that as flattery, as if flattering my ethnic group somehow flatters me. No, 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 no. It's perfectly racial division, ethnic divisions, racism in policy is perfectly consistent with totalitarianism. Just as consistent with the anti-Semitism of Tsarist Russia is just as consistent as the racism, the overt racism that you saw, for example, under the Soviet Union. Is just different variety of racism, not much different actually.
Is this a feature just of the? I mean, you've already said no, but do you think do you think that there could be a case in which the totalitarians of the right, if you want to call it like that, could embrace this kind of quote diversity?
Oh
Um,
yeah, oh yeah,
uh,
easy.
I was
Easy. No, in
thinking
fact,
Erdogan,
the
maybe.
right has largely accepted this leftist argument, for example, about racial representation. No one really debates. In my country today, the debate is over. No one debates the need for racial districts, for example. Harlem must be represented by a black district because the Harlem section of New York City is a majority black neighborhood. Therefore, the Congress, that district needs to be carved out so that we have black representation for that. If we were to consider the district, from a race-free perspective, just simply based on population, the Supreme Court has even said that that is unconstitutional. And certainly the 1965 Voting Rights Act in my country disfavors that. It's the assumed law on right and left. And the right is, oh, well, there are certain forces on the right, ugly forces on the extreme right, for example, that really are racist. They'd be perfectly happy to go along with a certain kind of racial quota system of their own. Yeah.
Yes, um, I was having in mind something like maybe some people would say that this kind of quotas would be a deterrent to some people like Hitler or so on, like racial totalitarians, because they wouldn't be able to be bigoted.
Well,
But
they'd accept the principle, but just shift the desired outcome. Look,
exactly,
yeah, racism is racism.
I was
If
thinking in
imagine
Erdogan.
Weimar Germany had protections of Jews, racial quotas for Jews, say, weird to imagine, but imagine all Hitler would have to do is come in and say, the Aryans are being disfavored, discriminated against. Therefore, we need a reverse kind of discrimination for Aryans against Jews.
Yes.
Both, the whole idea opens up. The whole idea of quotas opens up this area, which must necessarily entail discrimination and abuse. It is unfair on the individual level, no matter who does it and why.
Um, I have a couple more questions, and but they are a bit more miscellaneous. So, James, is there something else that you think I forgot to mention, to ask, or something else that you think it was essential for the essay?
No, no, I would just point out that in the United States today, an entire state, a southern state, South Carolina, the first state to secede during a civil war to protect slavery, the heart of the Confederacy, the heart of the Jim Crow South, is now represented statewide by a black senator, a Republican black senator. So, a state that is majority white, has a big black population, but a majority white state, not a district at all, but a whole state, is represented, including the white people, the Asians, are all represented by a black guy. What a wonderful situation. It has nothing to do with the fact that he's black, that he is a representative from South Carolina, in effect. It's not a question of reverse racism or wanting him to be black there to correct past racism. No, he was a Republican who was simply elected to represent the white and black people of the entire state of South Carolina. And that is possible in my country. The whole idea of racial quotas, when you have a situation like that, in a country that has elected a black president, the previous couple presidents ago, a country that has had blacks on the Supreme Court, a country in which some of the highest paid people in the country are African Americans. It is absolutely insane. It is absolutely insane to think that blacks need this kind of protection. It is absolutely insane to think that individual blacks are represented by having a black congressman from their district. It's wrong. It's racist, and it is so far from being relevant. It is obsolete, even in its motive, in my view. There is simply no need for such corrective remedial action in my country anymore. Blacks can get elected nationwide, statewide, even in the South. The entire remedial need has evaporated as far as I can see. That does not mean that racism is all gone in this country. It does not mean that there aren't even racial disparities in this country. What it does mean is that this entire approach to representation, racial representation, is founded on a false idea. It's totally misbegotten.
And my understanding is that it was presented as a temporary movement, right?
Right.
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 And you cannot have it both ways.
Go away. Yeah. But of course, the exact opposite has happened. Racial tensions have only increased in my country. These racial preferences have only, gotten further carved in stone and become a permanent feature of my country's laws. You can't really fix the problem by institutionalizing the essential problem itself, racism. It's just a flat contradiction. But of course, I should point out, intellectuals are very comfortable looking at people physiologically and deterministically. And so long as our intellectuals keep pushing us that way, our political elites will continue pushing us that way.
Thank you. So my miscellaneous question, one of those had to do with why do people only have one vote? And I think that I had never thought about that. And I think that answer wasn't very obvious even from the start, because my understanding is that at the beginning it was one vote per family head, and then it was changed to include women, and then so on and so on. But why should one?
The individual is the unit that thinks. Only individuals think. Only individuals judge. Only individuals have opinions. Voting can only matter because of individualism. Voting implies, in effect, individualism. It would make no sense to allow people to vote if individual judgment wasn't what governed people's lives, and people couldn't judge for themselves. It would make no sense. I know we've sort of come back around that a couple of times, but really that's what it comes down to. Only an individual can vote, because only an individual has judgment on this matter. Children can't vote because they don't have a fully developed judgment on this matter. It would make no sense to allow babies, 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds, even 15-year-olds probably to vote. So it must be a matter of individual. The fact that a parent has, as Ayn Rand points out, has 10 children doesn't give the parents 10 more votes apiece. No. It must be a matter of individual judgment. Only individuals can think. It's not as though the one person who can vote in the family is voting for the other people. Not at all. They will be able to vote for each of themselves when they are mentally competent to do so. Group representation is inherently offensive in this respect. It is inconsistent with the idea of voting itself, which is based on the premise of individual judgment.
But I get that. But my question was going more for instance, the father voting for having all the power of his children while they are unable. Why doesn't he have 10 votes? Or the parent of Britney right now, that she's whatever she has. Why can't the dad of Britney vote for two people? What is the um what is the rationale behind that?
He would be, in effect, forcing her, taking by force, in effect, her power to judge and choose for himself, arrogating to himself that power, that right. But it's an individual right, like all other rights are, necessarily. He can't judge for her. He can only judge for himself, even if he is her guardian. For example, he can make certain economic decisions, legal decisions for her, assuming, see, I'm a free Brittany person. I don't like the way conservatorships are. In fact, generally, I'm a critic of how liberally conservatorships are granted in this country. So I'm on Brittany's side, very much. On the other hand, let's assume that Brittany was severely mentally impaired and did need a conservator, did need someone to make her legal and economic judgments for her. Would that authorize you to make her political judgments for her? No. No. You have no right to think for her. Only individuals think. You have a right to pay her bills, as we can presume would be in her best interest, engage in certain legal matters, assuming her best interest. We cannot assume what she would believe. We cannot assume what her ideas would be. We cannot assume her political values, because only an individual judgment can even determine those things. In other words, could the conservator make her a Catholic or an objectivist? No, he can't. In that sense, she alone, even if she's in need of a conservatorship, she alone can make that judgment for herself. No one else is authorized to make that judgment for her.
Thank you. The other question has to do with one comment she makes about the Democrats instituting their voting process, and she considers that an actual violation and not a potential one. Could you comment, first of all, why? Because I didn't completely understand what's happening and why.
Absolutely is. It absolutely is. If I'm an African American who happens to disagree with my African American representative, what am I left with? It's not a question of ideology. The district isn't determined by ideology. The district's representation is determined by race. And I just happen to be of the same race. And so it's assumed that this person of the same race, who is my representative, will represent me because he or she is of my race. That is a profoundly offensive non sequitur. My values are individual. My judgment is about those values is an individual matter. It is a profound injustice to me to say that it is not the ideology that matters, the values of the person I'm voting for that matter. It's their race that matters most. And we have to protect more than anything the racial component of this representation, as if that trumps all the other interests that I would have in voting for someone. It simply does not, and therefore deprives me, an African American in an African American district, of my power to get my own representation. I am prevented from having my ideas and political values make the difference because race is all that matters to them. Race now will be disproportionately important to the outcome of this representation, this election for representation, and ideas will be correspondingly less important. Therefore, the actual ideas and values of the individuals are being pushed aside, disfavored, in favor of some physiological characteristic we accidentally happen to share. Well, if I'm black, giving me a black representative is a violation of my rights to judge and choose based on ideology. It's racism against the individual black who might disagree with the ideas of his black representative. There's nothing potential about that violation. What you're doing is you're saying ideas matter less, race matters more. That is a direct violation of the entire idea of voting. Why would you even have the vote if it was a matter of race? All you need to do is calculate, find the most representative person, I guess, out there who's willing to do it. The whole idea of democracy implies, as we say, individual judgment. And if it's not a question of ideas, if it's not a question of my judgment, if it's simply a question of physiology, if physiology is going to take precedence over representation, over ideas, say, then every single judgment, individual judgment in that district is having their rights violated. Actually, because their ideas are being prevented from being enacted through representation. It's the opposite of the consent of the governed. His consent is being thwarted, is being suppressed. His voice, his ideological voice, is being suppressed in favor of his skin representation, skin color representation.
Thank you. And I have two more questions left. And this one is, I'm trying to connect with all the essays that we have discussed about, particularly global balkanization, the anti-conceptual mentality, and so on. And she comments on how, as you said, that intellectuals feel at home with this kind of universe that they are trying to represent with these quotas, which she mentions that bring comfort from the and lethargy. Why is that? And who would, I mean, the intellectuals feel at home, but who would feel at home as well? And what could be the causes of that thing becoming more entrenched in the culture?
Well, moral responsibility is a burden. It's a big responsibility, and those who are afraid of moral responsibility will find refuge. I think that a lot of determinism boils down to a simple psychological fear of individual responsibility, and so it's comforting. It's not my fault. It's a question of the group I belong to. It's a question of our history. It's a question of the systemic racism or lack of racism in the world I live. It's not a question of me as an individual achieving anything. It's a question of understanding, well, you see, I'm just disadvantaged or advantaged. I have white privilege, or I live in a country of systemic racism. Whew. Individual responsibility is gone. If I don't succeed, it's not my fault. And how comforting it is. Now, as I say, I'm not denying that racism persists and still exists. I'm not denying that there aren't individual cases where people are tremendously, it's unfair how they're disadvantaged, even. I'm not denying that at all. But if you're afraid of individual responsibility and what that implies about how you have to step up as an individual to attend and take care of yourself and your own life, then you will find comfort in these kind of group associations, the advantages or disadvantages of history, and take solace in the fact that things are determined and beyond your control.
One of the things that I found more distressing in the culture in the COVID crisis were the people that they appeared calm. They were afraid because of the illness, but they were calm because they were going to be taken care of, and everything was going to be given to them. And I was really afraid of that reaction.
That I think, again, the welfare state and socialism provide a degree of protection against individual irresponsibility. I will be taken care of. I don't have to take care of myself. It's not my responsibility to take care of myself. Others have got me. How comforting for the immoral, for those who lack responsibility.
Thank you. I would like to thank Jonathan for her for his contribution, and also Carolina Ledesma, who from Mexico is sending 200 pesos.
Gracias.
So I think the last question that I have is, um, what is the ideal in this case? How does a society of responsible people look like, and how can we get there?
A society of responsible people is a society of individuals, a society that will judge each individual on his or her own merits. In political terms, it means that an individual is making their own judgment about political representation based on their own ideas, their own political thinking, not a matter of their race or their sex or some group that they accidentally were born into or happen to belong to. It is a color, I hate to use this term that's so badly kicked around and abused, but a color blind politics, a color blind legal system is the ideal, in which such determined physiological characteristics have no weight, no bearing, whatever, in either direction, either to correct for historical wrongs or to protect some race. No, because, of course, the individual is the morally significant unit. It is the individual that judges. It is the individual that lives or dies. Individualism. In one word, the moral ideal here is individualism and an end to all physiological group distinctions and discriminations in any meaningful moral or political sense.
Thank you. So that being said, this was a short essay, James.
Yeah, been
I think
involved in a lot of history. I know.
yes, I think we covered everything that had to be said here. And thank you very much again for this incredible conversation, and to the audience, thank you for being with us. I appreciate it very much. And if you like these conversations, please consider becoming an Ayn Center member. Ayn Center UK membership start by £10 a month, and please consider having it. There are a lot of perks associated with them. And
such
if you
the Saturday seminars,
exactly every Saturday
seminars on Leonard Peikoff courses, and if you subscribe, you can participate. You actually actively participate in those seminars, and that's just one of the perks.
Exactly. James is the leading person in those discussions, and he gives us all his knowledge through those lectures because they are difficult to grasp, and he has a lot of knowledge, and he chooses them for us, and it's very interesting and very helpful for us to even understand these things of objectivism even deeper. Thank you, James, again.
My pleasure.
So that being said, thank you very much. See you next week.